Let's go beyond the thought in human rights and freedoms. With the growing so-called freedom protests in this country, with the anti-lockdown and the anti-vaccine, there's been a lot of talk about freedom of choice and freedom of rights. This is of the belief that the government can't control where we go and what happens to our bodies. Straight away, I agree with these statements, especially when it comes to immigration and pro-choice for abortion. When it comes to Covid-19 though, that's not what these protests are about.
Through the streets growing by the minute. The 2,000 officers unable to disperse the 1,000-strong crowd, sparking a standoff. Dozens prepared for a sit-down, pleading for authorities to listen.
Why should I be forced out of a job? Why should anyone be forced to do anything? This is a human rights protest.
Okay, so this is kind of loaded. These so-called freedom protests very well are about human rights. I will break it down for you soon, but first, we have to understand what human rights are and why they exist. It makes sense to have human rights, not because they objectively, ontologically exist, but because doing so leads to better legal and moral treatment of people within society. Human rights recognize the inherent value of each person, regardless of background, where they live, what we look like, what we think, or what we believe. They are based on principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect, which are shared across cultures, religions, and philosophies. They are about being treated fairly, treating others fairly, and having the ability to make genuine choices in our daily lives. The United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. It was drafted in the aftermath of World War II, and to this day, these basic rights and freedoms still apply to all people. For the big question of how are human rights affected during COVID-19, we just have to look at 3 core statements on the website. Number 1, human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world, for no other reason than that they were born human. Now for the second 2. They set out basic standards for how people should be treated, including in emergencies. And the last one, they help protect vulnerable people from the worst impacts of crises. For basic rights and freedoms, as well as basic standards for how people should be treated, let's now look at the International Bill of Rights. There are a total of 38 rights and freedoms clearly laid out on the website for everyone to see. The rights that these so-called freedom protesters are talking about, believing that they've read all these rights, are these ones here, which I'll read out now. Right to rest and leisure, freedom of movement, right to work and to good working conditions. And lastly, freedom of peaceful assembly. Now the problem with all these rights and freedoms is in the last 2 statements I read out, including in emergencies, and help protect vulnerable people within crises. This pandemic, COVID-19, is certainly an emergency within society, and there are most definitely vulnerable people that need protection from the worst impacts of this crisis. Such examples of vulnerable people are people over 70, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, those who are pregnant, parents of a child under 12 months, people treated for chronic health conditions, and people with a suppressed immune condition. That means all of these rights and freedoms that people are protesting about have an immediate effect on vulnerable people. Now, because of that, we should look at the top 2 human rights laws. Protection of family as the fundamental unit of society and the right to life. For these 2 fundamental rights, specifically the right to life, international human rights laws allow the government to restrict certain rights and freedoms to protect public health and safety during a public health emergency for the safety of everyone in the community. Here is the main point stated on the website. Protecting public health and protecting human rights are not mutually exclusive choices. Measures to protect public health can protect human rights, like the right to life, and restrictions of human rights can sometimes be justified if they are necessary to protect public health. That means these lockdown laws and restrictions imposed by the government do have justification during a pandemic. To further what happens with these limitations, the website even shows a full criteria of what must be met by the government during this time. Finally, there is this statement. The need for restrictions must be regularly assessed, and the moment they are no longer necessary, they must cease. which is why the government shows roadmaps for how they plan to start ceasing on such limitations to rights and freedoms. In conclusion, I am sorry guys, but the government can force you out of a job and they can force you to do certain things within an emergency to public health and safety. Should the government also make the vaccine mandatory? Well, we can look at many things in society that are already mandatory, such as speeding limits, seat belts, voting, the drinking age, and of course, all children must attend school. Some of these are for public health and safety every day. So there's no reason why mandating the vaccine isn't also for public health and safety. Thank you for going beyond a thought in human rights and freedoms during COVID-19. If there's anything I missed, please let me know in the comment section below. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell because the next video is also going to be very juicy.